Thanks for tuning in for Gospel Solutions for Families on the Mormon Channel. This show is all about offering practical, relevant tips for raising children in faith. I'm your host, Amy Iverson. Today we're talking about a very serious topic, one that just looking at the statistics is impossible for any of us to ignore. It's suicide. It's heartbreaking, and it's happening in record numbers. It's taking the lives of those we love, and it's leaving many with questions about faith and God. We have to get real about suicide and how we talk about it in our families. Joining us to delve into this important conversation is Dr. Greg Hudnall, who has spent the past 2 decades involved with suicide prevention. Greg is the executive director and founder of Hope for Utah, and his expertise on suicide prevention is sought after nationally at the highest levels of government. He's a former high school principal, student service director, and associate superintendent, and has personally been involved as a first responder or consultant with more than 25 suicides. Greg, thank you so much for being here today. You know, suicide is one of those heartbreaking issues that spares no religion or race or gender or sexual orientation, marital status, it doesn't matter. But if we're going to get real about it, we have to talk about it. And you say that one of the biggest misconceptions that parents have is that talking about it is going to give their kids the idea. You say that's totally not true.
Yeah, and it's pretty common across the country that we're afraid to talk about it, but we're really trying to break that barrier, because the thing that we need to remember is individuals really don't want to die. They want the pain to go away. So they're suffering, and a lot of times they're embarrassed, they're ashamed, they feel like they're the only one. But we're afraid that if we mention it or start talking to them, it's going to give them the idea, where the reality is they've already thought about it.
They've thought about it no matter what media they've seen. They just, it's something inherent in people. They want pain to go away, and they think ending my life would be one way.
You know, unfortunately, it's become part of our society. I was working with a 14-year-old girl who had attempted, and I got to meet with her when she came out of the hospital. And one of the things she said to me was, she said, you know, Dr. Hudnall, I think we're going to be the generation of suicide. It's in the music, it's in the videos, it's in the television, it's in every aspect that is being out there that these young people in society are being confronted with.
And so we have to talk about it. So now we know that. Don't shy away from it. And are there times or ages when it's appropriate? When do we breach this conversation with our kids?
You know, one of the things we try to train parents to watch for those warning signs. The warning signs are talking about wanting to die, making comments that my family would be better off without me, young people going on the internet, looking up information about suicide. Those are the things that you start to worry about. And it's also when you start to see the behavioral changes in your child. You start to notice that they may be a little bit more depressed or pulling away from the family. It's really important for that family member in a private moment, so that we're not embarrassing the individual, but to pull them aside and use the I message. I noticed today you seemed really depressed. I want you to know that I'm worried about you. And so that you're really starting to open that conversation. We encourage parents to go one-on-one, go for a walk, go out for an ice cream, do something so that that child has their full attention, and then you start asking those difficult questions. And one of the things we train them to ask is, have you thought about hurting yourself? Have you thought about suicide?
I think that scares a lot of parents to death. So I have to ask, though, you say we look for the warning signs and then have that conversation, but is this something like the sex talk where we talk about it before we ever see those signs at a young age? And is there an age that you would say, this is the age you need to talk about it?
Yeah, we work with parents even in the elementary school. You know, unfortunately, we lost a 4th grader that took his life by suicide. In the state of Utah 2 years ago, we lost a 5th grader. And so we're training parents more and more because they know their children better than anybody. And it's important to start at that younger age to start building the relationship, not so much confronting them about mental illness or mental health, but about letting them know that you care about them, and that if they ever start to struggle, that you would hope that they would be willing to talk to you. But then also planting that seed that if I notice something and I'm worried about, I want you to know I'm going to come and visit with you.
Now, I think a lot of times parents don't have that conversation. I didn't when my kids were young in elementary school, and it didn't really come into my face until it happened to someone that we knew. And I think that's the case with a lot of families. It happens to someone in your neighborhood or someone you know, and that's when I had the conversation with my kids. I don't know if I did it right, but how do you suggest us navigating that conversation once we know someone, and then we have to talk to our kids about it?
Yeah, one of the things we try to role play with parents is to have that discussion, and the discussion is pretty much built around being totally honest and upfront. So, honey, I know you're struggling because you lost so-and-so, and I'm so devastated. I know you are. But one of the things that I worry about is that sometimes when someone takes their life, then it affects someone else. About 1 to 5%, depending on what study you look at, are what we call copycats or contagions. So when I'm having that discussion, it is, I just want you to know that I'm worried about you. That sometimes you may be struggling more than even you understand, and I'm wondering if you're willing to talk about it. And then we train those parents, if that young person isn't willing to talk about it, then ask the question, would you be willing to talk to someone else? So that we can get them to a professional mental health expert or whatever. Our biggest concern, Amy, is that especially a young person that's lost a friend to suicide, if they knew about it and didn't do anything, then they become a much higher risk. And sometimes it wasn't that they knew they were going to take their life, but they knew the friend was struggling and they didn't know what to do.
Then they feel the guilt.
Then
like
they feel,
everybody feels.
Exactly, they feel the guilt. But theirs is much more intense because of the relationship.
And I know that you had mentioned that it's not the time to preach to our children. How can we be careful about that?
You know, we want to be really careful not to preach, lecture, place religion on them or anything that way. What we really want to do is ask questions and then listen and let them know that we're concerned and that love is there. So you want to do it in a private moment, and it's not when you're angry or argumentative or whatever. And sometimes I will tell parents who's the closest. Is it at that time? Is it the father? Is it the mother? And then pull away from the family one-on-one with that child so that they're not being interrupted and they can have that hard discussion with them. But one of the things we've learned from our faith-based trainings on Sunday is that we are afraid to ask. We're afraid to talk about it. We think if we just pray about it, it's going to go away. And we've got to have the courage to notice those changes, those behaviors in our children, and then ask those difficult questions.
And you mentioned if they don't want to talk to you, you may need to have them talk to someone else. I mean, at that point, do you necessarily need to go to a professional? Do you seek out another adult for them to talk to, a leader? What's the right way?
For me, it depends. I try to gauge it by the emotional response. If they're sitting there crying, not wanting to get out of bed, and are so distraught over the loss of a friend, that's a pretty good warning sign that they're hurting and may need to talk to someone else. So one of the things that I try to do is there someone else that you feel comfortable talking with? It may be a young women's leader. It may be the bishop. But in the end, it also may be a professional counselor. And so that's why I try to build upon that, depending on how their responses are and depending on what they share with me.
And you've served as a bishop, and I'm sure that is, you want those kids to come to you. You want adults to come to you, but if you feel you need to send them to a professional, you can, but start with the leader in the church.
Very much so. And it's one of the things, Amy, that we do a lot of training with the young men, young women leaders, because a lot of times those individuals are much younger. They have a really good relationship with the youth because they're non-disciplinarians and they tend to have fun with the kids. There are those times when a youth will confide in them, and that a youth leader will notice some changes and worry about them and start talking to them. We train church leaders and everybody to always involve the parent. And there are some individuals who will push back and say, what if the parent's causing the problem? I always push back and remind them that parent lives with that child 24/7. They know if they're on medication. They may know things that you and I are never aware of. So it's really important that the parent is involved.
So every situation is unique. We know that. But you say there are some common threads, some warning signs. You've talked about a couple of them, but what are some of those things that we really need to be watching for?
So the first warning sign that always rises to the top is the hereditary. If you have a family that has struggled with mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar, dysthymia, when we talk about mental illness, depression, 99.9% of the people who take their lives are dealing with some sort of depression. depression is very common in our society, especially in the Caucasian world. And so one of the things that we really try to help parents understand is if you've lost a family member to suicide, a grandparent, aunt, or uncle, if you've had a family member that has struggled with depression or other mental illnesses, that's the first really important warning sign to be aware of. The second one is if kids start to pull themselves away from their family, if they start to become moody, you start to notice changes.
Is that just teenagers? Because
it fits across the board, doesn't it? In fact, I'll have junior high parents come up after a training, and they'll go, "You've just described my child." Yeah. And I try to remind them to look outside of the norm.
Combination.
So it's the combination, and the more warning signs you see, the more you want to be aware of and be cautious with. Talking about it, giving away prized possessions. We had a young man take his watch off, give it to his best friend. A girl give her guitar. So something that's very valuable. We also try to help remind them of situations, romantic breakup, disciplinary action, something that's happened in their life, and you start to notice the changes with that young person.
And you said kind of at that point, you're trying to persuade them that they don't have to end their life to end their pain, to let them know there is something to live for.
Yeah. The difficult part, someone that is struggling with depression or struggling with a mental illness and sees suicide as an option, they feel they're the only one. They are hurting, and in most cases what I have found is that they don't want to die, they want the pain to go away. And so you and I have to navigate working with them to be able to help them understand and to get them to a professional. I always encourage parents to get them to that next level, that professional mental health agency, that professional therapist that then can help them work through those suicidal ideation and other challenges they may have.
So we talked about how a lot of these warning signs can be across the board with teenagers. A lot of teenagers are moody. A lot of teenagers don't want to hang out with their family. And so when you're trying to differentiate between they have some depression, they're a normal teenager, or they're suicidal, is that something, are there definitives we can look at? Is this something we rely on the Spirit for? How do we handle that?
I think it's all the above.
Yeah.
Suicide is very complex. And what one young person responds to, the other one doesn't. And I tell parents, monitor your child's behavior so you can notice if this is one-off. A mother came up and talked to me, and she said, my son just lost it at the dinner table and was so angry. And she said, I'm worried about him. And I said, have you seen this before? Yeah, every other day. Okay, that's a warning sign that we probably need to intervene and provide some help. And so one of the things we talk about is content versus context. So the young person playing with his younger sibling, she takes his toy away and he says, I'm going to kill myself. That's probably not a suicidal issue, but it's something that we want to sit down with that young child, help them understand we don't say those things, versus a 14-year-old, 15-year-old that's gone through something that is very important to them, and then they make a comment, I'm just going to go kill myself. Much different content with the context. So we really try to help parents understand that. But listening to the Spirit is the most important. Parents know their children better than everybody. But I will say, I've now been involved with over 53 suicides with young people. And in those 53 suicides, only 7 or 8 of the parents knew the child was at that level. Kids hide it really well from their families. They'll text to friends, they'll share that information, but they hide it from their parents.
And that can really lead to some guilt on the parents' part. They're thinking, I wasn't in tune, but we can't say that, right? Because that's not the problem. The problem is not because of you as a parent. I think
That's
we have
right.
to put that forth.
Yeah, these were not bad parents. These were amazing parents that had amazing children who were struggling and hid it from their family. But kids tend to text. They tend to be very close and share private information, and they will reach out and share it with their friends and not share it with their family. And that's the other reason we try to train all of the leaders within a ward, within that church, to understand that, because they may share something with you that even the parents aren't aware of.
So if we talk about that community, whether it's a ward or a neighborhood or a school, whatever, these are tough questions for us to take that next step and confront a child, not in a bad way, but just to talk to them and ask them those serious questions you mentioned, like, have you ever thought of hurting yourself? I've seen things before on social media that I've contacted the parent and said, I just, but you feel like you're meddling and you feel like you're getting in someone's business that's not yours. Should we be worried about that, or do we have to do it? Is it our responsibility?
I would encourage every listener to take that next step, and that it is their responsibility. We train bishops and stake presidents and the youth leaders that when you see those or you hear those comments, it is your responsibility to contact that parent as soon as possible. Now, the parent may be aware of it, and they may even be embarrassed by it, but in a lot of cases, the parents aren't aware of it. Yeah. And the more we can involve them in that, the more they're going to be able to get help for their child.
So we talked about how it's a misconception that talking to kids about suicide makes them want to do the act. But what about when someone attempts or does commit suicide and they seem to get a lot of attention, a lot of love, and you want to give that to them because you want them to know they're loved. But I worry about other kids and seeing that as, it's a great way to get attention. It's a great way to get love. How do we talk about that with them?
It is a challenge, and it's one of the things when we talk with those individuals that, after a suicide, we bring our crisis team into a school, and it's why we don't have banners. We encourage kids not to come to school in their Sunday clothing because, they think they're paying respect to the individual, which they are, but they don't understand the bigger consequence it can cause. We don't let off balloons. We don't memorialize the incident because when we do, they think about the suicide. They don't think about the child. So we're very careful that way.
So what do you tell them to do?
So one of the things we do is we announce that we want them to write something positive, an experience, something that they had with that young person. And then in the counseling center, we'll collect all of those. And then we'll put them together in a manual for the family so that they'll have those memories and different things that way. It's why you have to be very careful because you always have young people who are on the edge. And when they see the power and attention that's given to someone, sometimes it can push them towards that. But stepping back, talking about the student who has attempted, I think it's very important to provide as much support and love so that they can feel. One of the things I have found with young people is they feel very alone and they feel disconnected. So as a parent, when we work with children that are struggling, we encourage them to find ways to get them connected. You have the risk factors, but you also have the prevention factors. And one of the top things in prevention is being connected to a family, being connected to the community. And that's why church is so valuable. A lot of people look at the top 10 states, which are northwestern states with high LDS population. And they tend to point fingers and say, it's because of your religion.
Right.
And I help them understand that the research shows religion is actually a resiliency factor. Because of that connectedness we have, it is a very powerful, important tool. It's when they fall out of it and they're dealing with guilt and other things that way that we start to see the struggles.
And how can you persuade a kid to get more involved again? I mean, if they're having those issues, then they are pulling away from family, friends, church. How do you, without, headlocking them in there, encourage them to get back involved without being preachy and too pushy?
I think it's a very difficult maneuver, and I think you have to be more careful that you love them and that you're always there to support them and that the door is always open. I think we have to be careful when we start to see that young person struggle. We tend to say, read your scriptures, if you go to church and pray, everything will be fine. Well, when you're dealing with a mental illness, those are not fine at the time. They're important later on when they start to become healthy again, but what we have to do is focus on the mental health issues, and that's where we really want to get them to a professional
help. But how important are those things for parents during that struggle?
Yeah. Well, and I tell parents, those may be the best thing for you. Those scriptures and that prayer and going to church because you build that relationship with the support system. I love Elder Holland's talk. When you look at General Conference, the last General Conference when he talked about the choir and how everyone needs to feel part of it, and then a few General Conferences ago when he talked about mental health should be as accepted as a norm of a broken arm or a broken leg. we as members of the church have got to get over that and to be more kind and more sensitive to those families that have a struggling individual. And we encourage members to walk up and put their arm around them and say, you know, I don't know what you're going through, but I want you to know I'm here for you. Do you know what that does for that family? Instead of being ostracized because we're uncomfortable, we're embarrassed for them, we don't want to make a scene, but there are other things that we can do to reach out and show our love and support for them.
Thank you for sharing that. I feel like so many people don't know what to say, so they don't say anything, but you gave us a great example of something we could say. You mentioned that people will point out places where the church is prominent and say we have a depression issue. And there have been some suicides recently where kids felt so much pressure to be perfect that people were led to believe that that was the reason for this suicide. How can we as parents make sure that we're not putting those unrealistic expectations on our kids? Again, not that it's your fault, but I think if we as parents can learn how to back off, something I'm working on right now, a little bit of the perfection expectations would be nice.
You know, I think one of the challenges within our church is we feel we have to be perfect right now. And I love when you listen to the brethren at General Conference, they talk about the journey. Truman Madsen mentions that a lot, that it's not right now, that it really does take time. And while it's important to have expectations for children, whether it's doing their homework, cleaning their rooms, and doing other things, it's more important to understand that child and what is realistic for them. And I think, you know, I have 4 children. When I first started out with my first daughter, all I had to do was cross my eyes and she'd start to cry. And I thought, wow, parenting is easy. My next one was a son, throw everything out. I think it's really important that you get to know your children, their behaviors. And one child, it may be a B is really good for you because I know you tried your very best. I'm okay with that, and then helping them be okay with it. It's that anxiety that we create as adults that our kids start to mimic. And so we really need to be careful with that. I think the other thing is our kids are too over-involved. We have them signed up for anything and everything. And I think we need to back off a little bit and spend, I love the concept of quantity versus quality. For 20 years, we got sucked up with quality time with our kids. I think the reality is quantity. When we would get ready to go on a trip, put our 4 kids in the van, we would fight the first 20 minutes.
No iPads.
Fighting over space, you know, everything that way. And it was like, why do we do this trip? And then the rest of the time, we had more fun with each other. When I hear families say, no, I don't do trips anymore, all we do is fight, I try to remind them, do you fight the whole trip, or is it just the first part of it? You know, look for ways to have that quantity time with your kids so they see you cry, they see you laugh, they really get to know you, and we're spending time with them. Right now, we're just running from thing to thing.
Yeah. I have to bring this up because you mentioned there's never one thing that we can point out that is a warning sign, but you did mention that in most of the suicides with which you have dealt, technology in the bedroom at night was a factor. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so as a first responder, I unfortunately have had to be with law enforcement in some very delicate, difficult situations. And one of the things that I've observed through the years is that in most of the homes that I was in where we lost a young person, in the bedroom, there was, and this is the child's bedroom, there was a cell phone, a computer, and a television. And I try to help parents understand that when we start to set our kids up, they start to pull away from us. And when we give them that opportunity to have everything to themselves, they're no longer connected to the family. And I love what the church talks about. When you have a computer, put it in the family room that everybody can see it. One of the things my wife taught our kids at a very young age, 9 o'clock at night, your phones come out, they go into a charger. We have kids staying up all night that are texting friends or being texted by friends that are depressed, suicidal, etc. That can pull them down. So we want to take that away from them, let them get their rest, let them be able to concentrate on other things versus trying to see themselves and compare themselves to others.
So your work, you focus on preventing suicides. It's having some great results, yet it still happens and will happen. Yeah. So what words of hope do you have for those families and friends who have dealt with it, are dealing with it, will deal with it for the rest of their lives? I think it can be easy to get really down yourself after dealing with something like that. words of hope for those people?
So one of the things that we have found is that there are a lot of great support systems out there, and I would encourage the families that are struggling with a young person and they don't know what to do is to reach out and get that support system. There's mental health agencies everywhere. The second part of it is to start finding others. You know, if you've gone through it with a child who has attempted, you have a young person who has a mental illness that they'll have for life. Sometimes it becomes so overwhelming, but there are great organizations out there that can be a support to you and a support to that family member so that they're not all alone. They can help you understand how to handle things that you can do, ways to be able to make it easier for that young person, make it easier for yourself. There are some serious challenges that families have to deal with, and you understand the pain they're going through, and sometimes I understand the depression and the frustration. But I also want people to know that there are a lot of opportunities for help. And then I think the other thing to remember, Amy, is the bishops are great resources. The LDS Church has amazing services out there. And if you as a family member are struggling, I would encourage you to talk to your bishop first. See what's available, see what resources are out there, and then let's get you help.
And do you find that the main reason people don't seek out that help is fear of being stigmatized? Are they ashamed? Is that why they don't?
Yeah. When I was a high school principal, I remember sitting down with a very prominent citizen. Their son was 3 years behind in reading, struggling in school, and I could tell he was getting more and more depressed and frustrated. So I brought mom and dad in. We sat down and I said, we can, because he's 2 years behind, we can get special ed services for him. And immediately the parents said, no, I do not want my son stigmatized. I don't want him labeled. I don't want anything that way. And I said, but your son's behind and we need to get him caught up. And eventually they came around. They were able to do some things to help him. That's the same thing I see with parents that maybe are struggling with a child with a mental illness, with depression or whatever. They may even be dealing with it. Mm-hmm. But the other hand, they are ashamed, they're afraid, they don't want their child labeled. But I would encourage, if you're a parent and you see these behaviors in your child, please get help. Because what we have found is there's a lot of resources that can help them be successful in life. Most mental illnesses begin between the ages of 10 and 14. So as a parent, we want you to watch that child, and if you have any questions, reach out to the professional.
And finally, since this show is about gospel solutions for families, how would you say that Jesus Christ and God's plan play into all of this? And maybe some words of advice for those of us who are trying to help others.
Yeah, that's a great question. I had a church assignment for 3 years, and I taught at the county jail. And it was very fascinating for me. And at my last part of time that I was there, Elder Holland came and spoke to all of the Institute instructors, which I was one of. And I'll never forget what he said, Amy. He said, if Christ were to come tomorrow, we know the first place he would be is the temple. But we also know the next place he would be is in a place like this. And that there is hope and that there is opportunities for us. Michael McLean has an amazing song. It's been out for 10 or 15 years, and it's called Safe Harbor. But it talks about the individuals in the grocery store checkout line who are struggling, people sitting next to us in church, in our classrooms or whatever. I think we need to do more like what Elder Holland talks about, more kinder, more sensitive to their needs, being more willing to accept them and being more willing to help them. I think that's what we need to do. And if you're a family that's struggling, get help, because there is help out there. And I really believe that the Savior's love is a piece of the puzzle to get us down that path, and then we need everybody to come together.
The whole community.
The whole community. Our mantra, and I'll close with it.
I love this.
While it takes an entire village to raise a child, we believe it takes an entire community to save one. And I can't tell you the number of kids who have shared with us. It was a scoutmaster, it was a coach, it was a seminary teacher, it was my next door neighbor that really helped me get through my difficult times. And I think that's the challenge to all of us within that ward, within that stake, within that community, to be that one, to be that person to reach out.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is Dr. Greg Hudnall. He is the executive director and founder of Hope for Utah. He's served as a bishop and is right now teaching the high priests.
Love it.
That's right. This has been an important conversation about how to talk about suicide in our families. For other resources to help those in need and those who have lost someone to suicide, please visit preventingsuicide.lds.org. Thank you for joining us. Gospel Solutions for Families on the Mormon Channel. Subscribe to the podcast on mormonchannel.org, the Mormon Channel app, or on iTunes.